I'm sure some of you have been here all afternoon with us through all two sessions so far. Some of you might have just joined us, but we, in the first two panels today, heard some great conversations about the latest research and some consumer dialogue around plant-based and cell-based meat. We've talked taste versus nutrition, what's driving consumer interest, the scientific hurdles, and how these alternatives might evolve to have a greater place on our plates in the future. So the big question remaining is, what will all of this look like in the grand scheme of things? So will alternative proteins play a significant role in the future of our food system, and what does this mean for Australia? They're the kinds of questions that we are discussing in this session. We know we have an enormous challenge facing us, almost 10 billion people to feed by mid-century, and greater demand for meat than ever in the face of dwindling natural resources and increasingly volatile climate and so on. So we know that our protein source will change over time, and how we produce protein will change considerably. So I'm hoping that our panellists today will be able to provide a bit of insight from their professional experience as to what we can expect in a few decades' time. But just to start, I might get each of you to introduce yourselves to the room, 30 seconds or so.
Okay. So Daniel Terrill, I'm here in a couple of capacities actually. I'm a partner at Deloitte Access Economics, leading the agribusiness group in Deloitte, Australia. So I was the lead author of the economic analysis that this report has launched today. I'm also from a farming background, including livestock. So, a livestock farmer producing a report on the plant-based meat sector certainly, raises some interesting questions. So, it's been a very interesting study, and I like to think I'm bringing a balanced perspective to these sort of forecasts.
Great, thanks for having me join the panel. My name's Sandro. I'm a medical doctor by training. I've just spent the last 10 years working overseas. I worked for the United Nations, for the World Health Organization, as a technical advisor to governments, 193 member states, on nutrition. Led a lot of work around child obesity, early nutrition, and also national dietary guidelines. Spent the previous 7 years in research at Harvard Medical School and University of Copenhagen, fieldwork in many developing countries around the world, looking at the rise of non-communicable diseases, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, lung diseases, the preventable burden, the tsunami of preventable burden that's currently upon the world, including Australia. Spent the last 2 years with the EAT Foundation as their CEO, sort of transitional CEO. I launched the EAT Lancet Commission, obviously, at the start of this year. Started some important conversations on behalf of the more than 30 scientists that fed into that global commission, and ran two very large global conferences like this of 1,000 food leaders from business, science, policy and civil society. And I do host a TV show on ABC and Netflix called Ask the Doctor. It's sort of a side pet project. I have my own foundation here in Australia focused on improving the nutrition of vulnerable communities and particularly Aussie kids. And in 3 weeks' time, I'll start as the new CEO of Vic Health, Victoria's peak health promotion agency. I'm new to the role, can't even say it yet, but not with that hat yet. So today I represent those previous positions and myself.
Hi there, I'm Louise Cordina. I'm CEO of Cordina Group, and I'm here to add a slightly different perspective, coming from one of Australia's oldest meat processing families. So my family invented the idea of poultry processing in Australia back in the 1930s, and as a business which exists very much in the mainstream consumer market. We're considered one of the country's leading innovators when it comes to retail and food service products. So here to add a little bit of perspective of how some of these issues are seen by the more conventional space.
Fantastic. As you can hear, we have three pretty exceptional panellists with us this afternoon, and I'm very excited about this conversation. Three of my favourite people. Sandro, I might get you to kick things off with a bit of a global perspective. Considering your role with the EAT Foundation and your role launching the EAT Lancet Commission, which I'm sure many in the room are familiar with, can you just talk us through, from the perspective of that research, what is what you've termed a planetary health diet? What do you believe the world should be eating, particularly with reference to protein sources?
Yeah, sure. So to understand that, you need to actually take a step back and even ignore us for a moment and look at the boxes to the left and the right of us, which represent the Sustainable Development Goals, which is 17 goals, 169 targets, and we now have 9 years or so 10 years to achieve them by 2030. It's this roadmap for global development, including SDG 2, which is zero hunger, which is in fact malnutrition in all its forms. But as you can see, it's water, it's education, it's health, it's equity, gender equality, and also climate change. How are we doing on those? Not very well is the headline. As we heard yesterday morning, we've heard many times, we're not bending the curves that we need to. And whether it's climate change and our inability to really mount a meaningful response at the global level, or whether it's the fact that now world hunger is again on the rise after decades of reductions. The last 4 years, world hunger has in fact has increased. A very, very sad reflection on the global community's inability to eradicate something that is totally preventable. We're now locking 830 million people out of our global food system. That is, they don't get enough food, they wake up hungry every morning. And that's on the same planet that now sees roughly 2 billion, 2.1 billion people overweight or obese, so eating too much of the wrong types of foods. What we're also seeing, though, is actually at that next kind of meta systems level is even more frightening. So these are not standalone issues. Why are more people hungry now than last year? Well, because of climate change and because of conflict. Why are we seeing an increase in geopolitical conflict? Well, every major geopolitical conflict has been associated with, not necessarily caused by, but major and very fast changes in food prices and food spikes. And the classic one that we often think back to is the Arab Spring. So in fact, geopolitical conflict, climate change, 15% of global greenhouse gases come from meat production, but about a third comes from our global food system. It's also, our food system is the largest user of fresh water. It's, good nutrition is essential to quality education, to access to markets. We know that the interlinkages with all of the different SDGs, but also what we see is the interlinkages with each other and these negative feedback loops. So, for example, as I say, climate change and geopolitical conflict largely driven, or to a large degree driven by the way we grow, process, transport, consume and waste food, is in fact driving hunger. So we're getting this feedback loop of the way we consume food in some parts of the world or overconsume certain types of food are actually causing hunger in other parts of the world through both directly but also indirectly through processes like climate change and geopolitical conflict. So you see other ones like antimicrobial resistance is another feedback loop that we're seeing. 70% of global antibiotics are used in food production, and antimicrobial resistance is a very, very real and apparent threat to the future of human societies. We may eventually run out of conventional antibiotics that we're able to use that we have used for many decades. Anyway, so this brings up the question, well, how do we get from the food system we have, where a third of food is wasted, poor diet is now the leading risk factor for disease in Australia, and depending on how you add it up, it's either number 1 or number 2 worldwide. How do we get from that picture to a food system we want, leaving no one behind, the SDG agenda, by 2030, and also safeguarding our planet? And so we brought together 37 of the world's leading scientists, including the head of nutrition at my former boss at WHO and also FAO, Walter Willett and others from around the world. And we asked them the question, can we feed 9.7 to 10 billion people by 2050 a healthy diet and have a planet that we can hand on to future generations that's in better shape than we found it? The answer was yes. And as always, it's a bunch of scientists, so the answer is yes, but. And what they really showed us was, so they went through a 4-stage process, which is important to understand. The first was, what does a healthy diet look like, period? Human endpoints. What does the body, regardless of where you are in the world, largely it's the same. Obviously, there are cultural and cultural and economic and social and also environmental parameters that will change what food that is. But largely from a biological perspective, the human endpoints, the biological endpoints of what your body needs to be healthy is the same. So the first was, what does that diet look like? And that was the Planetary Health Diet. The second question was, what can the planet entertain? And if we take the concept of planetary boundaries, what percentage of those planetary boundaries, what proportion can be used to produce food and still have the ecosystem services that we know we need to offset our carbon emissions, to fuel, fibre, and all of the other sources that or uses that we need, in addition to actually leaving some for the other million species that we often forget that live on our planet. The third was then, well, can we achieve X on Y? So can we get 9.7 to 10 billion times that healthy diet on the amount of resources that we can spare for the global food system? The answer was yes, and then the fourth question was, well, how can we do it? And that was that kind of political economy question. All of the social issues, that was not the focus of the Eat Lancet Commission. It was really an empirical analysis at the global level and aiming to start the conversation.
Yes.
Finally, what does the diet look like? Half the plate is fruit and vegetables, much more plants, plant-based foods, whole grains, nuts, seeds, healthy oils. Fairly dramatic reductions in red meat consumption for countries like Australia. We currently consume about 100 grams per head more than even the dietary guidelines recommend, but this would see a reduction even further from that. About a hamburger a week or a steak a month is what the recommendations were, based purely on the best available nutrition evidence from these 37 scientists. This is not my recommendations, this is the recommendations from the Eat Lancet commissioners. But also, as we've seen time and time again, including the Global Burden of Disease study, it's not just a discussion of the things we need to eat less of. Actually, probably even more important than that discussion is the things we need to eat more of. And that's fresh fruits and vegetables. 19 in 20 Australians don't eat the recommended amount of vegetables. It's whole grains, nuts, seeds, plants, mostly plants, and healthy oils.
So the Commission looked at both production and consumption. So my follow-up question to this is, in an Australian context, how accurately do those recommendations fit?
Well, the short answer is they're just as accurate here. I mean, we're not a different species. Some countries might think so sometimes, and we might think so, but Australians, whilst being the best country in the world, we're not a different species from the rest of the planet. So the biological endpoints that the diet was developed to achieve and to achieve optimally are the same for Australians. I suppose what is often forgotten, though, there are political economy questions. So this is not a transition that should happen overnight. This is something that will take maybe 10, 20, 30 years to achieve. And the other thing to think through or to add into the mix is that we often forget we live on one planet. And I know that sounds kind of cliche, but what I mean by that is, even more so than our oceans that, you could argue maybe don't mix our global food system and the emissions and all the challenges that result from how we produce food truly is on one planet. We have one global food system. So the Eat Lancet Commission clearly said that if we're going to achieve a healthy diet on a healthy planet for 10 billion people, we're going to need to dramatically increase trade, and we're going to need to grow the right food in the right place. And so that presents an opportunity for Australia to be growing food as efficiently, and meat even, as efficiently as possible, as environmentally friendly as possible, and to be a major export to then other countries in our region who, let's not forget, there are more than 1 billion people on this planet that actually need to be increasing substantially the amount of animal source proteins and particularly red meat that they're currently consuming. So again, this discussion of the world needs to eat less red meat to save the planet is absolutely not true, and overlooks the fact that we have left behind more than 1 billion people, including a large number in our own region, and including many women and children who are currently suffering from diseases like anemia because they, again, don't have access to the same food opportunity, nutrition opportunity, food systems that we are currently, overburdening. Yes.
Absolutely, but it's so important to make that distinction between the developed world and the developing world and the various complexities that exist. So, Dan, as Sandro has highlighted, one of the major recommendations from a protein perspective of that plate, that optimal human diet, and particularly the recommendations made for developed countries that do eat quite a significant amount of meat, was to shift towards a greater representation of plant proteins and consume less animal-sourced proteins. So thinking about that from an agricultural perspective and sitting here in Australia, maybe you can help us understand what protein production, if you want to put it in those terms, does Australia's landmass currently support? And then what is the potential in looking towards a more nutritious, healthy, sustainable, future-proof food supply for us to adapt? Because we do have limitations, right, in terms of our land, our climate, etc.
Absolutely. Look, I'll answer that with reference to the modelling we did here, but first perhaps I'll just mention that we are looking at the Eat Lancet diet and what it would do to the global economy, because often it's acknowledged that yes, it would have sustainability, desirable sustainability outcomes, it would be good for health. And of course, both of those things drive positive economic outcomes. But we ask the question but what about the economic impacts?
Hold it a little closer.
What about the economic impacts? It's often feared that, yes, it's good for the environment, it's good for health, but you might hurt the economy. So we tested that and put the Eat Lancet diet, the same diet, through the globe, every food system, and it was a consumer-led change. So there was no policy causing it. Consumers desired over time to, effectively eat something different. And what we found was it was a good thing for the global economy. So not only is it positive for health, which of course will drive economic impacts as well, good for the environment, it's also good for the economy. Yes, there are winners and losers, but overall the global economy has become more efficient. And there's quite a few reasons for that, but the single most important one is that a lot of livestock systems globally are not the most efficient use of resources. So, it doesn't make a lot of sense when we're looking to feed a bigger and more hungrier world to put perfectly good grain through an animal and then eat the animal with a large efficiency loss. But then we looked at Australia, and the answer for Australia was a little bit different globally. Australia was kind of break even, in fact, a slight loss. And the main reason for that is that Australia is actually very good at livestock production. It plays to a lot of our competitive advantages. We have a lot of the inputs into our livestock systems can't be repurposed. So, cattle eating native vegetation, native grasslands, there is no other food-producing use of those resources. And similarly, cattle, integrated with cropping systems and eating mulch and, crops that aren't good enough for consumption are used for animal inputs into animal systems. So there were winners and losers in Australia, no doubt about it. The Eat Lancet diet is a vastly more severe reduction in meat consumption and to plants than what we've modelled here and what we see for plant-based foods in the next decade. That certainly may be a long-term future and a multi-generational sort of change. But in this report, we've looked out to 2030. So it's quite short-term when we're thinking generations. So the Australian potential, I think, thinking as a farmer, as someone who has produced and does produce livestock, along with other things, the plant-based meat sector does offer opportunities. If you do have resources or a farm that can't produce anything else, nothing's going to stop you from continuing to do what you've always done. The point of plant-based meats coming in as an alternative is that you can transition to that if the economics add up, and that'll only be for some of Australia. It's probably 4% of the Australian landmass at any point in time is used for cropping. A further 9% is used for effectively pastures, cultivated pastures. And it's only in that 4% and that 9% where the potential to grow production best lies.
Which is a huge area of land, considering the size of Australia, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So Australia's a very big place, so there's small percentages, but for the rest, yes, you can't, there's just no point trying to crop it. We're a long way off having anything that would be economical. So, livestock or nothing very much for parts of Australia, but, for that 13%, there's no doubt that when you crop that land, there are constraints to it, of course. You need water, you need fertiliser, you need to generally more capital. But you do produce more food per unit area when you're cropping it rather than grazing it.
Just one more question for you, Dan. Do you see an immediate opportunity for those? We know there are tens of thousands of Australian farmers who are producing crops and horticultural products, and Australia already produces hundreds of thousands of tonnes of protein-rich plant foods, legumes, for example. A lot of that goes into the global commodity market where it doesn't necessarily command a premium. Could farmers be, with opportunities such as this, industry such as this opening up, redirecting some of that agricultural produce into a supply chain such as this and potentially making greater profit as a result of that? Because it's a value-added application.
Absolutely, yeah. We really don't see, when we see growth of a plant-based meat sector, we don't see it coming at the expense of a livestock system. Australia is producing more, the world's demanding more. Most of our livestock products are in fact exported. So, the diet that Australians adopt, yes, it matters, but it's not the main driver of livestock systems. The growth of a sector like this will come because we're having to produce more, and we can't continually produce more livestock products because of natural constraints. So it's it's not coming at the expense of livestock systems.
Yes. Just a quick one. I want to bring Louise in as well.
Yeah, no, super quick. I just want to echo what you said. So we've seen a dramatic rise in flexitarianism in Northern Europe, and when you speak to the fast casual industry in Northern Europe, brands that we know and love here in Australia as well, the dramatic growth that they've seen in even plant-based burgers and things has not come at the cost of meat-based burgers. It's actually been new customers. Now, that's not necessarily great news for public health or for people like me, but I think it does send a message that this is not, it's not about ending meat tomorrow. It's actually a transformation that's going to happen slowly, but there's interest from consumers, new consumers, to be, rather than eating more meat, maybe it's a way of at least curbing our meat consumption for the foreseeable future and then eventually making a transition.
Yeah, right. So Louise, I'm really curious to know, so you mentioned your family brought poultry production to Australia in the 1930s. Some might assume that you would be anti-plant proteins or meat alternatives. Could you explain to us why has Cordina expanded into the plant protein category and also now looking at meat alternatives?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question, and listening in a few of the sessions earlier, I think there's a real misconception that the entire meat industry would be anti-progress when it comes to other types of proteins. But as a experienced consumer-led manufacturer in Australia, consumers want what consumers want. I think the definition of suicide in any business is to keep doing what you do. And as a business we're a family business still, and we've survived 4 generations and many decades, that doesn't come from continuing to be stuck in your ways. You're always having to listen to what consumers want and be willing to evolve your business. So I think it's a fatal mistake for any manufacturing business to do one thing and say, well, this is what we do, and then be naysayers of anything that becomes an evolution of that space. So that would be one element of the answer. Beyond that, we're a business which is about innovation and responding to consumer needs and our customers and our customers' customers. And we will always evolve, and that's, of recent times we evolved out of poultry. So whilst our origins were poultry, we sort of broadened our horizons into other proteins, including non-meat proteins. So we do already have a division of our business that does manufacture non-meat proteins, and that's about continuing to offer customers solutions to all of their requirements. And I think that's probably a real key point to this discussion, that for me, the future of protein is an inclusive future. It's not one where it can be either or. It's not going to be plant-based products coming to phase out meat products. I think that there's some really interesting positive impacts that the movement towards plant-based products can actually have on the meat-based products, because I believe meat-based products will always be part of the future, but does that mean that we can't do things better? I think there's a really great positive impact that we can see on the more conventional protein industries, meat-based industries, actually looking inwards and saying, well, we're going to have to get our act together and make sure that we're also presenting our best, most sustainable option. So I think there's actually another real arm to the discussion around the positive impact that the plant-based movement can have on the meat production industries. So for us, it's really just around a continued evolution of what our customers need from us. And I think one thing that we've learnt about consumers through our many years is consumers want what consumers want. As soon as we become preachy about telling people that we have to be one extreme or the other, then we're probably going to have a big disconnect between what the research says and what the reality will demonstrate. At the end of the day, retailers and manufacturers are just responding to people voting with their feet. And there's, often the big retailers will be an easy target around what they're selling or what they're doing, but at the end of the day, they're just selling what people are buying. So I think for any manufacturers in our space, burying your head in the sand and just continuing to want to do what you do is probably a fairly short-sighted strategy.
I'm really curious to know your fourth generation Cordina clan. What do your family think of this move, this diversification, and your employees? I mean, you have 1,300 people at Cordina Group. What's the...
Oh, my family's gotten used to my crazy ideas. No, look, I think, our business, our DNA has always been about innovation and about really listening to what people want. So I think to survive the generations that we have, which, let's face it, it's sort of fairly unusual these days to still have businesses that are in the fourth generation of family ownership. I think we have always been very willing to adapt ourselves and listen to Australian consumers specifically. So we have always evolved as a business. We've brought many firsts to Australia, a lot of innovation. As I mentioned, in the retail market these days, I mean, we launch many hundreds, thousands of products. So evolving what we make is really just part of what we do. And when we made the decision about 5 years ago to build a dedicated facility to really replicate what we do in poultry, in other proteins, that was because we felt that we sort of filled a void in the market that wasn't being replicated in other parts of the protein industry. And for us, the plant-based space is just another one of those gaps. If we see a manufacturing problem and nobody is sort of providing a solution to that, then our natural sentiment is to say, okay, well, let's overlay the synergies and see if that's something that we can help with.
Cordina's launched thousands of products over the years. How have you seen consumers change in that time? Obviously, plant-based you have identified as a major trend coming out now. What is that?
Sure.
How does that fit into the scheme?
Probably the most recent trends from an overarching consumer perspective is the changing household in Australia. So if we go back 10, 20 years, we had a very traditional, two parents, two kids type of household. That's really changed a lot now. So we have a lot of more households, which will be 2.5 people, if you want to use the statistical term. So a lot of singles, a lot of people with shared accommodation. The traditional meals are not what they used to be. People don't necessarily eat 3 meals a day anymore. So that's really meaning that customers are requiring a different type of product. A lot of focus on convenience, a lot of ability to be able to tick multiple boxes. People don't want to make a compromise. They want to be able to get something that's quick and easy, but not feel bad about it. The real magic bullet in sort of Australia at the moment is being able to give consumers a product that they both feel good about, whether it be from a sustainability or a welfare perspective or a nutrition perspective, but that doesn't come at the sacrifice of having to not be able to grab that on the go. They want convenience as well as, and they also want value. One thing that's sometimes missed in these discussions is that no matter what the trend, price is still king in any market. And what we find is that that point around not having to compromise, you need to be able to tick the value box as well, or else you become in a space where you're solving the problems for a very small amount of the population. The real prize is to be able to tick all of those boxes and still be good value, so that you're then genuinely solving problems for a meaningful amount of consumers.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of a nice segue into talking to plant-based meat alternatives, because that's, I guess, the combination of consumer drivers that a lot of these companies are trying to satisfy. It's producing a product that still offers the taste and the convenience and the affordability people are used to, but addressing concerns, whether it be around environment, animal welfare, health. Dan, maybe you can talk us a little bit through, I presented earlier today, for those of you who missed it, on some of the findings of this report, and it's available on Food Frontier's website to download right now if you're interested. But what you've illustrated through the research is that Australia's sector for plant-based meat alternatives today is about 150 million in consumer expenditure. You then looked at the 3 growth scenarios for 2030: conservative, moderate, and accelerated. And for the moderate scenario, assuming that's, probably the most likely, it's certainly the one that we've based our recommendations off, it's almost 3 billion in consumer expenditure. Can you talk us through what were some of the variables, some of the assumptions and data that went into those calculations?
Sure. So we consider a whole range of things when we paint these future scenarios, because ultimately there's a great deal of uncertainty even looking at next year, let alone in 2030, as to where markets will go. So we look at a whole raft of sources to form these estimates, and we probably start with the central case and then have an up and a lower around that. The central case it's a function of talking to participants in the industry now and their expectations. It's talking to our global friends and experiences overseas. It's considering new food trends and new diets that have emerged in the past and how quickly they emerge. And because this isn't the first time, another way of bringing a similar product to something that's already on the market. It's not the first time it's happened, so we're going to learn a lot through things like soy-based, plant-based milks, or even vegetable oils, or there's been a raft of similar things in the past, so we're going to learn a lot through that. And we have to think about the consumer here, because there's a lot of excitement and with any new industry, and let's get on with it. It should happen really quickly, but the economic reality is it's not the choice of any one person to change overnight. It's the function of all of Australian consumers changing, and that takes strong cultural and historical factors there that mean it doesn't happen as quickly as some people think it might. Not to mention the capital and the supply chains that also need to change. So currently Australia's importing a lot of its inputs into the plant-based meat sector. We do expect that to change, and in Australia obviously we can, as we said earlier, very well placed to provide those inputs. So we've 7% is the the estimate of all meat, including plant-based and traditional, what would be provided by the plant-based meat sector in 2030. That reflects essentially a continuation of the growth that we've seen to date. And 7% is roughly similar to the market penetration of soy-based milks as a proportion of the total milk market. And then around that, we ask, well, what if capacity constraints get lifted quicker? That demand is higher than we expect. Growth actually accelerates, and that's when we end up at the 3.7 billion sector you mentioned, Thomas, the upper scenario. And then we have to look at the other way and say, well, is Australia? There's a possibility that Australia isn't actually good at this, and we might have to continue to import. So, what happens there? And that's a more modest $1 billion sort of dollar industry. The central case basically sees us a little bit better than self-sufficient in plant-based meats. In other words, we produce as much as we consume, which, is true of some of agriculture, but overall, of course, Australia exports 2/3 of what it produces. And, that reflects that we're actually very good at agribusiness on a global scale.
And that moderate scenario had about roughly 6,000 full-time equivalent jobs that would be produced across the supply chain in that instance.
Yeah, it did. Mostly in manufacturing, but
Right.
everything upstream, which includes agriculture.
Yep.
So, potentially at that scale, a very big employer.
Yeah. Sandro, in recognising that a whole foods plant-centric diet is likely optimal for human health based on the research, the data we have available to date, you acknowledged earlier that plant-based meat products potentially play a role in helping people transition towards more whole plant foods. What are your thoughts on these products, and this idea around processing being a problem? Are processed foods bad? This was a question that came up in the original panel we had this afternoon.
Yeah, so that's a question that I think comes up a lot. Again, though, it's important to remember that this is going to be a transformation that will happen over quite a long period of time. And meat will stay on the plate. Meat, I agree with exactly, most of what you said. I think that meat will stay on the plate. It will allow us, maybe red meat will reduce slightly, but other areas, other types of animal source proteins will stay important. We'll find more efficient ways of growing and using maybe more of what we do grow, and growing it more efficiently. There are huge, as you said, yield gaps across the world that we need to close. And Australia is, again, a great country to step up and lead that, because there's a lot that we can teach and share in the process. Having said that, we are going to need to increase our plant-based, sources of macro and micronutrients. It's going to have to take up more of the plate. We need to find ways of getting consumers to be comfortable with going on that journey. And so I do think plant-based proteins will be an important part of that. I think the evidence is emerging that plant-based proteins do seem to be healthier when it comes to chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease. There's a publication in JAMA just last week, in fact 2 in the last month, looking at both cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality, and diabetes outcomes. And again, it suggests, although these are observational studies, that plant-based proteins and consumption of those over animal source proteins is associated with lower risk of death and also a number of diseases. Having said that, processing, we kind of fear the concept of food processing. And again, I'm happy to take these things back to kind of the big picture again. So what does food processing mean? It means just basically altering food or changing it in some way between the farm and the fork. And an example of this is frozen peas. That's the example we often hear. Enormously nutritious, in fact, probably more nutritious than peas that are, taken fresh to the fruit and vegetable store. It leads to less food waste, so less of the food is lost from the food system because it's able to stay on the shelf or in the freezer longer, an added benefit of many of the processing techniques we use. What is an issue, though, is ultra-processed foods. And so there are 4 levels of processing that we talk about in the NOVA classification. Ultra-processed foods are, though, quite problematic. And it's usually because these are foods that are kind of built from scratch and not necessarily the ones we're talking about today. It's usually the junk-type foods.
Confectionery?
Yeah, including confectionery. And on average, they're much higher in salt, unhealthy fats like saturated fats, and sugars. And again, there's a strong association between the consumption of these foods, ultra-processed foods, and disease outcomes. Again, a study that was just published last week in a very reputable global journal showed that Australians are now consuming about 42% of our calories from ultra-processed foods. So that's really bad news for our health. and it's fueling the obesity epidemic that now affects 2 in 3 adults and 1 in 4 and probably soon 1 in 3 of our kids. In fact, in 10 years' time, it's expected that there'll be more overweight Australians than normal weight Australians. Having said that, though, the second largest contributor to our calories is from unprocessed foods, fruits and vegetables, about 35%, and that's very good news. So there's a big block that's kind of the ultra-processed foods. I think we need to make inroads on that, and maybe plant-based proteins and alternatives can help us to do that. But we also need to make sure that it doesn't come at the cost of the high consumption that we currently do have still of fresh whole foods. They need to continue to be on our plate. So it's complicated, but it's not impossible. There are important political economy issues and winners and losers that we need to navigate. But the only part I would disagree with what you said was that, producers and retailers simply respond to consumers. And if that was the case, advertising wouldn't exist. I mean, advertising, obviously, and the role of the rise of social media and influencers and paid influencers, they're hugely influential on what people are eating, and particularly younger generations. So I think there is a role also for retailers and for industries that are leading the way, that are innovating and finding healthier sources of proteins to transition our economy and also our populations, and safeguard the future of our populations and our planet. I think there is a role for them to be normative, that is to shift the norms and to use the levers they can at the political level, but also the levers that they can at the societal level through things like product placement in retail places and advertising. They're just 2 examples, though.
Yeah. Louise, and by the way, I assume, Louise, that part of your comment that you made about that was the fact that Cordina Group is B2B, not B2C. So you don't interface directly with consumers, do you? You don't advertise to consumers?
No, most of our products are products that are B2B.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, marketing is a whole nother layer to that proposition. But simplistically, in some of the examples where, there might be some specific noise around products which people complaining about, why are these products put on the shelf at a certain level, etc. I mean, there's ultimately the retailers are all fighting for the same thing, which is market share, and they're trying to drag people into their stores, getting that foot traffic in. So they're going to respond largely to whatever they think is going to bring more people in the door. That's just the simple economics of it. Mm.
My final question for you, Louise, is what role or where do you see Cordina Group in terms of what you're producing in, say, 10 years from now or even by 2050?
I agree with the expectations around where the mix will balance out. I think certainly people will opt out of certain meat products. Consumers will continue to vote with their feet for those products that tick the most boxes. So for the meat proteins which are able to fulfil that delivering on nutrition, delivering on value, delivering on convenience, then certainly I do expect to see people choosing to think more about the footprint that they leave, start to make different choices about what they eat for those reasons. So my expectation is that we will see an erosion of certain meat proteins, and we'll see some transition from meat proteins into plant-based proteins. And I mean, what we have already been seeing for decades, which is the exact same trend, is the transition from beef to poultry, realistically. A couple of decades ago, beef was the most eaten protein in Australia. If I go back 20 years, I think it was about 34 kilos per head per year of beef, which was well above poultry at that stage, which was in the 20s. Australia now eats almost 50 kilos of chicken per person per year. And as it stands, Australia is one of the biggest meat-eating countries in the world. But the fact that consumers have transitioned from beef to poultry, there's no magic to it. It's purely because poultry has been able to better deliver on more of those boxes that consumers want ticked. So it's better value. It's the most cost-effective meat protein in Australia. It's perceived to be the healthiest meat protein in Australia. It has better welfare credentials as a baseline than other animal proteins such as traditional pork type of products. So, I think that consumers are going to continue to make those same choices, and I think the future is to have versatility and a lot of options for people to choose from, so that they can make the choices that are right for them. And I do think we'll start to see more people wanting to have the option to eat non-meat-based products as part of their regular weekly menu. I think that it's our job as food manufacturers to make sure that we're providing solutions and making sure that there's availability so that people can make the choices that they feel are right for them.
Yep. We have almost run out of time. We're going to jump to questions. I've just got one last very important question to ask you all. What's the best plant-based meat alternative you've ever had? If you had to pick one.
Well,
just for those that might be curious in the audience that haven't tried one.
I think it's hard to go past a meal at Smith & Daughters, for sure.
Okay.
and I just ate something very good outside, I have to say, from the, what was the chap?
Rogue?
The Rogue chap, yes.
Okay.
It was very good.
That's one recommendation.
You can skip me. I'm not sure I don't have an answer, but I will go outside and try our friends at Rogue, and I'll check out Cordina next time I'm in the supermarket.
Personally, the Beyond Burger is the best I've had, but
okay.
As a parent of young kids, what they like is probably more important to me than what I like. They like the corn products.
Corn, old school.
Chicken nuggets had some totally full. So, could not tell the difference, which, given how fussy my children are, that's really saying something. So,
there you go.
Corn for us. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being part of this discussion. It's been wonderful.
Great.
Some questions?
So, we do have a couple of minutes for questions, and we've actually received some questions that have come through the app. A very fitting one that sits under the banner. We're talking about feeding 10 billion people and the SDGs. I'll read it out here. Poverty is the key mediator of hunger and food insecurity as such. How will alternative protein help if people cannot afford to buy them?
It's a very good point. A lot of the products that we're seeing at the moment using very novel ingredients or novel manufacturing processes are more expensive than conventional meat. So do you, perhaps this is an economics question. Will that price point, in your opinion, Dan, fall over time with economies of scale, become more accessible?
Yes, absolutely. We think meat is cheaper, frankly, because it has scale. It has history, it has established supply chains. The same, ultimately plant-based meat is a more efficient way of getting the same thing. Once you get equivalent scale, there's no reason why it can't be comparable and ultimately even cheaper.
Yeah.
Because, at the end of the day, we are wasting good food by putting it through an animal. So if some of that can be redirected and, people consume it directly, that's going to feed more people.
And what's interesting also is to see, and it's, we're talking about very complex issues here, but in some regions of the world, it would seem that the premium for grain is potentially increased as a result of redirecting that into livestock systems. So it's putting things out of balance at a global scale in certain regions. There are some plant-based meat products actually in developing countries that have been able to produce product at a very, very affordable price point, which is interesting to start to see companies entering those markets, such as India. There's a company called Good Dot producing this mutton-like product that has just gone wild, and it's priced very competitively.
If I can just make a quick comment. I think also, again, let's not forget, we live on one planet, we have one food system, and we actually need to make room for the 830 million people that go hungry every night, and the hundreds of millions of women who continue to suffer from preventable diet-related anemia because they cannot get access to even an egg or a small amount of red meat because of the way we are currently consuming in richer parts of the world. So there may also be a moral imperative that leads to some sort of macro redistribution. I know it's very big picture, but at the end of the day, climate change is the biggest threat to eradicating poverty across the planet, and our food system contributes a third of all emissions, plus then leading contributor to ecosystem losses, water consumption, nitrogen, phosphorus runoff, like the list goes on. So if we can find more efficient ways of feeding the wealthier parts of the world, even if alternatives don't kind of trickle down or percolate across to the poorest parts of the world that actually probably also just need to have access to an egg or to the very things we have long taken for granted, if we can make room in the global system for those 830 million people to get access to the food system and have a planet to continue to survive on through utilising some of these technologies, that in of itself would be a great outcome, let alone trying to, assume that they're going to forego their meat so that we can continue to overconsume ours.
We're at a balance, absolutely.
Great. We're going to throw it straight to the floor. We've got a very little amount of time left, so I'm going to go for 2 questions, but I'm going to ask with maximum 30-second responses from one panel member. So anything burning on the floor? Short questions.
It's a question for Sandro. You just touched on eggs, and I'll declare I work for Australian Eggs. I'm the Marcoms manager there. My frustration with this conversation is that eggs get leapt right over in this process of transitioning from meat product to non-meat product. Yes, it's an animal-related production. However, it isn't meat as such. Can you tell me what your view on the role of eggs are in that?
Yeah, sure. So my experience is in low and middle income countries. I'm not an expert in high income countries like Australia. I'll leave that to my colleagues. There is very strong interest from the global community, the United Nations, including the World Health Organization, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are investing huge amounts of money in bringing egg farming on a fairly small scale to Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan and the poorest parts of the world, because it's acknowledged that it's a great way of delivering high-quality animal source proteins to people who are currently completely left out of the food system.
Great. Another question. Final question of the day.
So you had as a follow-on from a question you had about that the price of plant protein is too expensive. And yes, economies of scale will help bring that price down. But I would have another question to that. Isn't meat too cheap? About the true cost of food.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's effectively subsidies to food production, not just meat. I mean, it's not the only food production system that has environmental costs. But, something like a global carbon tax would certainly see meat, particularly red meat, go up quite significantly. We have actually modelled that, and diets are unfortunately very resistant to price changes. So it's got to be a very big tax before you get fundamental shifts away from meat towards plants. You'll get shifts within meat, probably from beef to poultry pretty quickly, but it has to be a very big tax on something like carbon to get a meaningful diet change.
Wonderful. Well, that's a wrap. Please thank and congratulate Thomas and the panel for an amazing session. Big topic, so not easy.